The protagonist stood next to a young blonde man who told Julia von Rosenthal that she had done a really good job. Then he plunged his sword into her belly, and she only in the last breath asked why His Highness was doing this to her, because she didn't realize what she had done. But the man only aggravated her wound and cut her body open to deny her any chance of rescue, and told her that the role of Julia von Rosenthal was over, and he was no longer interested in her, so she could die in peace. She fell to the ground, and all she could do was stare at His Highness in front of her. And then he said that he would have absolutely no regrets about this deed because he had tolerated her ugly face every day for a long time. Moreover, given her past merits, the funeral of this girl would be held with honor and magnitude. At this point, the protagonist remembered everything that had happened between them. She wondered if everything he had told her about love and that he had expressed his love to her was really a lie. And all this time he did it with hatred in his eyes, after which the protagonist confessed that she really believed in his words and so happily handed him her heart. But it was all a lie. But the man looked at her calmly and then turned and walked away, saying that Julia von Rosenthal had only imagined it because she was too absorbed in her dreams. And then alone, the protagonist tearfully stated that the price of love is betrayal and death. And probably the outcome would have been different if she had been beautiful, because it was foolish to believe the emperor because it was really impossible to love her. Then looking at her scarred hand, the girl thought that if she didn't love the emperor, she would have found a better use for her life. And then the girl with tears in her eyes looked at herself and thought that the curse had broken, and only when she was dying could she achieve what she wanted so badly. And wonder how beautiful her hands were. Julia von Rosenthal, commander of the Knights Guards, died at the hands of the man she loved so much. This girl was a duchess known as the Sword of the Empire, defender of the imperial family. However, behind the scenes of the magnificent facade, she was a cursed sword. There was a legend of a curse passed down through generations in the main character's family, because the head of the house had once killed a fire witch, and dying this witch in her last breath cursed the young man's family and said that all his descendants would not survive his youth and would die. The eldest son caught a fever at the age of 10 and did not survive. And soon a fever struck his youngest daughter, and unable to break the curse, Howard went in search of another witch. And so he went to the house of the ice witch, who wondered if Howard had come to her before he broke the fire witch's curse. But after thinking about it, she said that in that case, the man only needed to learn Franz's sword technique, and only that method could work, because this ball had such a strong cold that it would help resist the fire of the fire witch. And this sword technique was primarily designed to fight the fire witch. And then the man said that he was willing to do literally anything, and he didn't even listen to the flaw that the ice witch wanted to tell him about. So Howard said the most important thing to him was to save his daughter. And the witch only smiled and told the desperate man that she would help him get rid of the curse, since he had also helped her by killing another witch. In the end, with the help of the ice witch, Howard's daughter soon recovered and began learning the frozen sword technique. And thus this child was free from the curse of death. Yet the inevitable came. And then the man, looking at his daughter's agony, asked why his child's face had completely changed if they had already broken the curse. But the witch calmly said that she had indeed previously warned that this method had a disadvantage, because the coldness of the sword would affect the child's appearance. Then she added that when his daughter could master the sword, her true appearance would return, so she had to train hard, but warned that the appearance would return only after she had mastered the technique perfectly. But at that moment, the maid Judy came in and asked the heroine why she was so pale and what had happened. Then she said that she should be getting ready. And at that moment, Julia von Rosenthal only thought that her maid looked insanely young, and her body was thinner than before, and her face was not so old, and so the protagonist had some thoughts. So excitedly looking at Judy, she asked how old she looked. And the latter, a little surprised, said that their mistress looked about 17, and they were about the same age. And then thinking about it, Julia von Rosenthal realized that if she was 17 years old now, then it was 8 years ago, and it seemed like she had gone back in time. Then she looked at herself in the mirror and thought that she didn't understand how it had happened, but it didn't matter, so now she had to concentrate on what was coming. And touching her reflection, she realized that the curse that had been placed on her now had to be removed somehow. And since the girl remembered everything that had happened, it should not be difficult, for this story was not a legend but the truth. And what the protagonist didn't see before she died, she still felt it. She didn't know if it was a dream, but if the story flows according to her memory, she'll be sure of it. Then she sat down in front of the fireplace and began to ponder how she could avoid being killed again by the crown prince. Then she thought that perhaps she should take revenge. But at that moment, looking at such a harsh look of the main character, Judy, with tears in her eyes, shook and wondered what was happening to her. And the awkward Julia von Rosenthal only thought that she had unknowingly made such a face, and he had no purpose to frighten this girl. So she looked at her carefully and apologized for scaring her, and said that she was just thinking. But Judith calmly said that she was just a little surprised because the girl looked like she wasn't doing well. But the protagonist said that everything was really fine. And at that moment, her maid smilingly informed her that the girl must definitely go to the crown prince's birthday party. And the protagonist is just shocked to think that the prince's birthday is the day she first fell in love with him 8 years ago. And if she falls in love with him again, she's in for another horrible death. So she firmly informed her maid that she wasn't going to the birthday party because she was going to a special training session. She asked what it was all about, but the protagonist was adamant that she had to get rid of the curse. And Julia, shaking her by the shoulders and crying, said it was just a legend, so it didn't make any sense. At that moment, Julia von Rosenthal looked at her confidently and said that this was not a legend, and that only by achieving mastery of the sword would she be able to break the curse. Then she sat down on the bed and thought about it. Judy looked at her carefully and asked her why she had decided to make such a hasty decision. And the protagonist only asked if her maid remembered the day she first went to a social gathering, and then added that on that day everyone looked at her as if she were a monster in the midst of them, and then confessed that as a child she was terrified of those looks and ran away. But now it's gonna be different. So she took her maid by the hand and asked her to help her, but the girl looked at her and realized that she couldn't resist. As a result, the next day the protagonist took everything she needed with her and thought that all preparations were over. Then she handed the letter to Judy and asked her to give it to her father when she left the estate. And the girl tearfully told him that it would be the only time she would ever do something like that. Seeing how her maid was worried sick, the protagonist only smiled and thanked the girl and promised that she would be fine. After that, she resolutely walked out of the house. And then the maid kept her promise and went and took a letter to the Duke. And he asked him unhappily whether his daughter had run away and left this letter behind, for it was the crown prince's birthday and not just some party, and asked Judy if his daughter had not even given any reason for her behavior or told him what she was going to do. But the girl calmly said she had only done it because she could no longer bear to watch her mistress suffer. And then carefully looking at her, the man only exhaled tiredly, and then hiding her letter said that it looked like the girl was really self-confident to just leave the letter and not even talk to him normally. But that was still not enough reason to explain his daughter's absence from the reception. Then he looked at the maid carefully and told her that Julia von Rosenthal had apparently been injured at fencing practice today. And the excited maid only asked what he was talking about and why he had spoken so suddenly about it. And then the man rose from his seat and confidently looked at Javi and said that it meant only that no one should know that Julia von Rosenthal had left the house, and asked if the maid understood him, and she only nodded her head in agreement. In the end, while riding in the carriage, the father of the protagonist thought that his family had supported the emperor for generations. If nothing happened, Crown Prince Leonardo would become the next emperor, so his daughter also had to be present to meet the imperial family. But after remembering the maid's words that she could no longer watch her mistress's agony, he reflected that he should also have let Julia do the intended. Then looking at his little pendant where the picture was, he thought that he had to trust his daughter's choice. So he would just wait patiently for her to return and hope that she would be all right. Eventually, after some more time, the Lord reached the imperial palace and smiled happily as he greeted His Highness the Crown Prince and asked if they were doing well. But the man calmly looked at him and said that everything was really fine, but then asked why he did not see his daughter next to the man. And he only bowed his head guiltily and said that it was really his fault because Lady had been injured during the training. And luckily she wasn't hurt badly, but it was hard for her to move around. The Lord looked at the young man behind the prince's back and told him that his daughter would be well enough for the coronation ceremony, so the young man should not worry. And he only thanked the young man and went away with his servant, after which the aide looked back at his prince and wondered if he was already on his way back at this point. And Prince Leonardo himself calmly stated that unless Julia von Rosenthal was their original target, it was all just a waste of time. And he just couldn't stand the looks of all the other girls who were staring at him so brazenly And then the assistant listened carefully to his words and said that in that case, today's party was over for them. And Prince Leonardo only looked back out the window and smiled slyly to reflect that he was really in anticipation of his own coronation ceremony to finally meet the protagonist. And the girl stated that after her first debut, rumors about her quickly spread among the nobility, because she was considered a duchess by the monster of the cursed duke. And so the main character became a monster to everyone just because she didn't look pretty. That's why it didn't take her long to get used to the darkness. So she avoided people and even tried not to look out the window. But 8 years before the main character met a prince who approached her as if it was fate. And he charmed the girl with his tenderness, willingly giving her all the attention and care. And he was the only one who seemed to ignore her body, which had been altered by the curse. But that turned out to be a lie. And then the madly disappointed Julia von Rosenthal thought only that if she looked as she had in the past, Prince Leonardo would surely use her again. Then, looking at the entrance to the cave where she was sitting, she thought that it had been about 3 months since she had climbed into the mountains, and so her 18th birthday was very soon. So at least out of respect for her father, she had to go back before then. Since initiated knights, nobles swear allegiance to the imperial palace upon reaching their 18th birthday, and is officially knighted. Since ancient times, their family had sworn an oath to the imperial family, and that meant that the girl was destined to tie her life to the prince, which made her mad. And so Julia von Rosenthal realized that apparently this guy had planned everything so well from the beginning. But then she realized that it wasn't enough for her to use the curse to get rid of it as quickly as possible, because the curse had broken moments before she died, which meant only one thing. She had to push herself to the brink tomorrow, and determined at last to rid herself of this torment. She was sitting in ambush in the morning looking at the monsters and thinking that her fighting spirit was really good. But she didn't realize when the monsters had gotten so much bigger, because no matter how much the protagonist jumped between them, they seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. But then she was shocked to notice that in the midst of all these monsters, there was a man, and she absolutely didn't understand how she didn't notice the moment he appeared, and how this guy was going to stand alone against all these monsters. But in the next moment, then the girl noticed that that guy's sword shone brightly, and some kind of insanely powerful aura appeared around it. And then Julia von Rosenthal finally realized that this guy was a sword master. But after she saw how he dealt with each of the monsters in a flash, she realized that if things continued in the same way, the sword master would soon kill everyone, and she didn't know what to do. But the next moment, she managed to dodge an attack that hit not far away from her, and she tried to catch her breath in horror, not realizing who had attacked her with such a strong destructive power. Then looked back in shock and realized that now she was being attacked by the monster leader. And the protagonist could not even imagine how this monster, which lived only in the shadows of deep forests, was here and how it was possible. At the next moment, he roared furiously and rushed towards the protagonist, and made one attack after another. And at that moment, Julia von Rosenthal thought that a one-on-one battle with such a monster was indeed insanely risky. But afterward, during her escape, she thought she should have punctured a vital point, and then she'd have a chance. And then still dodging it, so I wondered how long it had been since she died and been reborn, and did it really end that way? But then she made a decisive leap toward him, and thought that with her current body, she could only simulate a fight, but that's all she could do. So she used her special Aurora blade technique, and her sword shone brightly with a blue icy light, and then delivered a devastating blow to the monster's leg, causing it to stagger backwards. And then the girl gathered all this remaining strength into a fist and struck another blow with her sword, which hit the target, and it looked like a blow of ice crystals badly wounded the leader. And the protagonist was just happy to think that she had managed to defeat him, and after such a battle, she tried to catch her breath, because it really was not easy. But at that moment, she heard the voice of a guy who said that it was too early for her to relax, and she just worriedly thought about who was here. But he calmly advised her to turn around. And then she noticed another monster in front of her, and in the next moment, the guy said that the main character was probably angry now because of everything that was going on. After that, he joked about how he had just defeated all of her relatives in appearance. But afterwards, he smiled and told her that his heart was breaking because he wanted to help her so badly, but he had a crazy important meeting. So he said goodbye and left immediately. And at the end, he told the girl that she would be fine. And the next moment, there was a rumble of an attack that came insanely close to the protagonist, and she managed to recoil at the last moment. After that, looking at the insanely angry, snarling monster, thought that this guy really had no reason to help her. But leaving her alone in such a situation was not nice. But he still left, and so the girl determinedly thought that she had to survive anyway, no matter what it cost her. Whereupon she began to massacre the monster one by one. She staggered and couldn't keep her balance. Then she fell and looked around at the monsters and realized that she couldn't even raise her hand because she was killing them, but they kept coming, and she didn't understand what she had done wrong. After which she only reflected that if it was possible, she just wanted madly, badly not to die here and now in this way. But at that moment, as if responding to her prayers, an insanely bright light shone around, which blinded these monsters, and they immediately began to scatter in fear and disappear from her sight. And eventually, as the color slowly began to fade, the girl finally cut her true appearance. But by then, she didn't even realize it, because she had lost consciousness much earlier. In the end, when she opened her eyes in the morning, she stood up sharply, looking at her hand, and literally could not believe what she saw, because this whole body looked like it was completely foreign to her. Then she began to feel her face and hair, and stated that her skin was insanely soft, and she had long silky hair. And apparently she had actually been able to break the curse. She was shocked at her surroundings and thought that yesterday she was sure she was going to die helplessly. But now she was fine, and everything was better than she suspected. But then she noticed that she was surrounded by monsters again. But she smiled as she realized her sword was on the ground, and thought that she had some urgent business to attend to, so she had to defeat all the monsters as quickly as possible. And after saying that, she launched one attack after another, and only stated that even though she did not spare her strength and gave her best, but there was a great lightness in her body, which made her insanely fast, plastic, and resistant. In the end, when the battle was over, the protagonist went to the creek and looked around herself and said that she had really changed, and apparently when she put all the energy into that battle, because she thought it was the last one in her life, she finally awakened. And when she woke up, her wound was healed, and the curse was completely gone, and she got a bright core of magic. Then she took out her sword and saturated it with her magical energy, running magic through it, and looked at its bright light, and noted that this color was clearly different from the past. She looked at her weapon with tears in her eyes and thought that she had indeed become a sword master, and that her curse was finally broken, and that she had received a bonus. So she thought that she should rush to her father to finally show herself to him. But the next moment, because of how joyfully she waved the sword, and also because of how much this sword has experienced over the past few days, and especially since the girl has now become a master swordsman, the weapon simply could not withstand and broke in half. And the main heroine, awkwardly looking at it, did not even know what to do now. At this time in the mansion, the butlers were pouring wine for the Duke, and inquired whether he was so much worried since it had already been 3 months since Julia's escape. But he calmly said that if he was really worried, he would have gone together to pick her up long ago. So now he trusts his daughter and is sure that everything will be fine. But the butler only calmly assured the gentleman that the girl would be back soon. For whoever said what, their young lady was the greatest genius in the history of the family, and she was not the sort of person to break easily. And then the man reflected on what his butler had said and stated that from early years, his daughter had shown talent in every way, and she was unsurpassed in everything, and even in the speed of her magic, which was not an easy task. And her technique and mastery of weapons from an early age was developed beyond her years and amazed even adults. But everything was spoiled by the fact that there was a curse on their family, and so the appearance of his daughter, who was ugly, became a prison for Julia and isolated her from society. And the man was insanely bitter from this realization. And only because he understood the motivation of his daughter, he immediately did not look for her. But at that moment, an excited Judy burst into the room, panting with excitement, to tell the Duke that their Lady Julia von Rosenthal had finally returned. And she looked as if she'd run a great distance without a break just to tell him. And at this moment, the Duke rushed out of the house and thought that if it was really true, then he should hurry up and meet his daughter in person, and then immediately shouted and called her. But looking around him unhappily, he only wondered where Julia was now. He saw some unknown blonde girl in front of him. But Judy, pointing to the girl, said that she was his daughter, but he didn't seem to believe it. And at that moment, the girl who had risen from her seat and smiled happily at Julia greeted her father. And then the man finally remembered that earlier his daughter, when she was still small, looked exactly the same when she smiled and greeted him. At that moment, his knight came up to the Duke and handed him the family symbol that he had personally given to Julia von Rosenthal on her birthday. So excited and still unable to believe it, he asked if his daughter had returned. But then the girl carefully looked at her and told her father that it was really her, and that it was really her. Then she looked at the Duke carefully and waited for his further actions. At that moment, the man suddenly reached for his weapon and said, looking at the girl resolutely, that if she was really his daughter, she should have fought him now and defeated him with her sword. And the maid, only smiling happily, snatched the weapon of her knight, who was madly embarrassed by such an action from the main character. And then she calmly informed the guy will take the sword only for a short time. Their battle seemed insanely fierce and focused, so much so that at that moment lightning bolts were literally flying around them. But the protagonist wasn't going to give up even though she was insanely exhausted from the long road and still had little control over her new body. But then she made a decisive lunge with great speed and strength, and then easily knocked the sword out of her father's hands. And the man, looking at his sword, which was stuck in the ground, thought that such a defense means only one thing, that it was undoubtedly his daughter, so he looked back at her with joy and finally greeted him. After that, the girl rushed into his arms, and he pressed her closer to him, literally could not believe that she managed. And the protagonist only happily informed her father that she became a master swordsman. While the Duke was madly pleased with the arrival of his daughter and proud that she had coped with all the trials, for all of this from the outside watched from the heart of the butler, who mentally stated that he was literally heartbroken at such a picture of the reunion. After all, he was madly happy for the protagonist, who was able to overcome everything. At the same time, Judy, who was also watching, said that the picture was really incredible and amazing, because she couldn't believe that everything was so wonderful. And at that moment, the protagonist turned to her maid and thanked her for her help, because it was thanks to her that she was able to become what she wanted and return as promised. But Judy, unable to bear it any longer, immediately rushed over and hugged her mistress and said that she would like to congratulate her lady from the bottom of her heart. But unfortunately, Julia could not let her go anywhere. For all this time, Judy had been worried sick about her. And the father, looking at the reunion of his daughter with the maid, who was also her friend, said that they could go inside to talk a little. The maids were chatting about the return of their lady, but some of them still hadn't seen her. Then one of the maids smiled happily and said that the lady was the same girl who had come in with the Duke, and the other was literally shocked by it. But the girl smiled happily and said that it seems that the curse of Julia von Rosenthal had already been lifted, and it really was not just a legend, and that their young lady was the first person in the family to break the curse. When the other maids heard about it, they literally glowed and offered to come to greet their mistress in the evening and to congratulate her on such a great achievement. So they did, and so they immediately went to the main character and now stood by her bathtub and questioned her about the water temperature and whether everything was fine. Then they helped her wash her hair and stated that her hair had become insanely silky. And the girl just thanked them and looked at the ceiling and thought about the fact that finally she was able to relax, and she wanted to sleep and rest after all the worries of the last few days. She wanted to sleep at least a little. Then she closed her eyes, and the excited maids only told her that it was not allowed to sleep in the bathtub. In the end, she met her father in the dining room for dinner, and the man calmly looked at his daughter and told her that her birthday was coming up and asked her what she wanted for a present. And then the protagonist calmly looked at him and said that in that case, if he really wanted to give her something, she wanted to give him a gift. And the Duke only wondered if it was really her wish. And the main character thought that it was a winter sword that had been handed down from generation to generation in their family. And it got its name because it contains the magic of winter. And then the Duke thought about this sword, that he had thought that Julia von Rosenthal was too young to give this sword, but now she was a master, so she could control it. Then he said that in this case, tomorrow afternoon, the girl had to come to his office to receive her gift. The girl only looked at her father with a frantic look of joy and thanked him for his trust. As a result, the next morning, the protagonist, tired and sleepy, was warming up after a good long sleep. And then not a minute later, one of the maids knocked on her room and asked if she could come in. It was Judy, who smiled and told the protagonist that she had woken up crazy early. Then she started pouring her tea for her to enjoy in the morning. And the protagonist looked around at her and said that she was very grateful to everyone for giving her such a nice welcome back party, but said that she planned to go to her morning workout. And after that, she wanted to stop by for lunch with her father. And when she heard about it, Judy approached her and smiled happily and offered to help the protagonist pack. And she just thanked her happily and agreed. And in the end, while the girl was busy styling her hair, the protagonist thought about the fact that finally she will be able to get her sword back, because earlier in her past life, where she was 8 years older, it was she who possessed the sword. In the end, when she went to her father's room, he opened the secret passage, and Julia only wondered how long it had been in his office. but he calmly said that he was going to tell the girl about it as soon as she became an adult. And Julia von Rosenthal thought about the fact that she already knew about this place, so she felt a little guilty for having to pretend. But she realized that she couldn't explain what had happened to her father. So when he opened the door, he told her that when the protagonist became the head of the family, she would have to run the place. And here were all the items that had ever belonged to the past heads of their family, and they were guarding their family's history. And so you had to treat all these items and artifacts with care. Then the man held out his hands to the case where the famous sword of their family was and said that now the sword was her weapon and asked the girl to look at it. She took his hands and looked at her new weapon, which had been completely familiar to her before, and thought that the light was much brighter than it had been in her previous life. It must have been because she had gained the power of a sword master. The Duke said that this sword seemed to have always been waiting for her, and she only smiled at the weapon and said that it seemed to her that the sword had originally belonged to her. But at that moment, the father turned to Julia von Rosenthal and said that last time he had given the girl a favorable treatment, but that she knew she had to go to the palace on her birthday. And then the protagonist calmly agreed, and then thought that on that day she would meet again with the prince who betrayed her, because of which she had a terrible pain in her chest. And she just grudgingly stated that those memories were insanely clear, which hurt like crazy, because even though it was her past life, but her return to life had only recently happened. And so as a consolation, she approached her father and then gently hugged him and thanked him for all this time he believed in her and waited for her. But the man only calmly hugged his daughter in response, only pitied the girl for the fact that she had to face such difficulties. As a result, the protagonist again saw a picture of all the aristocrats who were next to her during her debut. At the sight of her, madly wanted to see her face, and they did not understand how it is possible to be so ugly. And other girls discussed that if they had such an appearance, they would just kill themselves. And then, amidst all this, Prince Leonardo was the only one who calmly took her hand and told her not to pay attention, because she was a beautiful sword that would shine forever as long as the empire existed. Then he smiled and looked at her face carefully and asked her to raise the sword with the hand he was holding it with and stand behind him. Then, with the same hand that he used to hold her so tenderly, he struck her with his sword and told her that he had endured her ugly face every day for all that time. And finally, the girl saw it all again. She woke up in shock and was finally able to catch her breath. And when she realized that she was still in her room, she ordered herself to calm down because she could not be under the influence of this young man. As a result, a little later in his palace, Crown Prince Leonardo was getting ready for the event, and his assistant said that this time Julia von Rosenthal is going to the palace. Prince Leonardo calmly said that this time the girl will not run away from him, and they will finally meet. But then his assistant, looking at the young man's so self-satisfied face, he asked what his plan was. Then he stated that Prince Leonardo was apparently insanely interested in her. Then he said that somehow this girl was going to become a knight after her oath. But Prince Leonardo calmly said that first impressions were of the utmost importance, even if the person he was talking to reminded her of a horrible monster. So he had to do his best to impress this girl. In the end, around the same time, the protagonist finally arrived at the imperial palace, and then the anxious father called her by name several times, but she did not respond. So he asked if she was all right, but the protagonist only tiredly said that she was just thinking a little because of excitement. At that moment, the father helped his daughter down from the carriage and gently took her hands and told her that she really shouldn't have worried, because it would be unwise to be nervous now, especially since he would be by her side. And the main character looked carefully at her father and thanked him for being there for her and realized that now she would not be alone. So she calmed down and became much more optimistic. And then the father smiled happily at his daughter and said that it seems that the girl was really in a good mood. But the main character only happily suggested that they finally go inside. The second prince was looking at his mother empress and said that Julia von Rosenthal was arriving today with her father, and there were rumors that this girl looked like a monster. It was the second Prince Jeremy. But before the Empress could reply, the Imperial Guardsman who had been announcing the list of arrivals decisively announced that Pascal von Rosenthal had arrived with his daughter Julia von Rosenthal. And then the absolutely confident and determined protagonist stood before the Imperial family and looked them over with confidence. Then the Emperor and Empress, looking at the protagonist carefully, greeted the Duke and wondered if his daughter was with him. And then the man took his seat and, pointing to Julia von Rosenthal, said that this was his daughter, who had come to be knighted. The emperor was excited and thought that he literally could not believe that this girl was so beautiful. Then, noticing the displeased look of the duke, who understood his thoughts perfectly, the emperor immediately rose from his seat and brought the sword and placed it on the shoulder of the protagonist. Then he said that now Julia von Rosenthal had to swear allegiance to the empire and also swear that she would serve only the crown prince. And then the protagonist, looking at the smiling Leonardo, thought that this was the moment that she was so much afraid of, and also warned that in this life she should not pay attention to his smile because it was just a pretense and hypocrisy. And so she looked earnestly forward into herself and apologized to His Majesty and said that she would not swear allegiance to the prince. Her father was literally shocked by something like this and did not know why his daughter was doing this, because earlier he could not even suspect her intentions. In addition to the duke, the empress was also shocked, along with the second prince, who literally could not contain laughter because of the comicality of this situation. At that moment, the emperor looked at the girl seriously and asked, "Is she really not going to take the oath of allegiance to the crown prince?" But at that moment, she looked at each of them with determination and said that it was just like that and she refused to do it. And the emperor only looked at her unhappily and asked why the girl was doing that. And then the protagonist, with even more determination, and said that she really did not want to raise her sword for the crown prince because she wanted to raise it for the entire empire. And so she wants to swear allegiance to her specifically and asked her permission. And Herzog only thought sadly that His Majesty's orders were absolute and disobedience meant treason. So he had no idea what his daughter was thinking when she said that. And at that moment, still with the sword still leaning on the shoulder of the protagonist, the emperor looked at Julia and asked her if she took responsibility for the words she had spoken today. And she calmly said that it was so, and she was ready to be punished if necessary. But at that moment, the duke intervened in the conversation, who was well aware of how it could end for his daughter. And so he bowed and asked if he could say a few words, and then said that his daughter had become the 5th sword master in the empire. He asked her to demonstrate her skills, and then she fulfilled her father's request and drew her sword, which shone brightly with a blue light, which clearly indicated the enormous power of the owner of this weapon. And then the emperor grudgingly thought that sword masters were valuable talents because they were not easy to defeat, and moreover, it seems that this was the first female sword master in their empire. And then the emperor, after looking her over carefully, said that if it was the duchess's wish, she might not swear her allegiance to the crown prince, and in return, she would be appointed commander of the Winter Knights. The protagonist was shocked and thought about what the emperor had just offered her. Then she told His Majesty that the position was too high for her, so she was afraid she wouldn't be able to handle it. The Winter Knights are one of the 5 great knights of their empire, and even a master swordsman should not be appointed as a commander if he does not know how to conduct business. Thinking about it all, the empress only stated that it was quite an amusing situation and a very unexpected turn of events, which was really previously unlikely. But at that moment, the emperor looked at Julia von Rosenthal and said that her refusal was unacceptable because otherwise she would have to swear allegiance to the crown prince, and asked if she was ready to accept the position. The worried Julia von Rosenthal only looked at her father and mentally asked him for some support or advice. But from his face, she immediately realized that she had to decide for herself. But after scrutinizing the crown prince, who had so easily taken her life before, she realized that she was willing to do anything to avoid swearing allegiance to such a scoundrel, even though she could see that he was disturbed by the situation and could not find a place for himself because he did not understand what was happening. So she bowed to the emperor and said that she was ready to accept the position and thanked His Majesty the Emperor for giving her the opportunity and for such trust. And then he again put the sword on her shoulder and said that in that case, he would appoint her as the commander of the Winter Knights of the empire. The empress only wondered if this girl really wanted to take the position of the head of the empire. In the end, when everything was over, the second prince walked with his mother and only laughed with all that happened at the knighting initiation, and then asked the empress if she saw the face of the crown prince, because it was really a funny sight. The empress calmly said that apparently the duchess was madly disliked Crown Prince Leonardo, and in this case, her behavior was understandable. After that, they thought about the fact that the family of the protagonist is the family that for many years built a close relationship with the imperial family. It is because of his unique strength, and because Pascal, father of the main character, took care of His Majesty everyone, was sure that his daughter will also follow the same path, and will take care of the crown prince. But then the empress called her son closer and whispered something in his ear and told him that if he did everything right, the throne would be his. And the boy only happily said that his mother was really the smartest woman. And in the end, at the same time, Crown Prince Leonardo, remembering the main character who with such determination to refuse to swear him in favor of the empire, thought that if everything was really very easy to get, it would not be so very interesting. The harder it is to get something, the happier it is when you get it. So I thought he'd make this girl his property. At this time, the protagonist going home thought about the fact that their empire had only 5 knights. These were the bodyguards, which protect only the emperor, the Order of the Guard to protect the imperial family, and the Palace of the Shadow, which performs secret missions in the darkness, and the Black Lions of the Empire's Vanguard and the Winter Knights of the Vintners. And so the protagonist still couldn't believe that she was their commander because it was quite burdensome. But at that moment, her father turned to her and seriously looked at her and asked her if she realized what she had done today. Julia von Rosenthal only thought about the fact that she was really obliged to swear allegiance to the crown prince, and it should have been an ordinary ceremony. But after remembering what happened, she told her father that she wanted this sword with such a great history to protect not just one man, but the entire empire. Her father calmly said that defending the future emperor is the same as defending the empire. But the protagonist calmly said that she agreed with him. But she wanted to protect everyone living in this country, and of course she knew that it would be difficult, but she was determined to do it. And then, carefully looking at her father, only awkwardly exhaled and admitted that his daughter had grown up very quickly, and he did not even have time to notice it, and said that in this case, he would respect her wishes and will not argue. And she only smiled and thanked her father. At this time, in the headquarters of the Winter Knights, the guys were discussing that some 18-year-old girl was now their commander, and there were rumors that it was the daughter of Duke Pascal. And then one of the knights said that Absolute did not understand how it could happen. And the other guy, who was unhappily moving chess pieces in his hands, said that whatever Julia von Rosenthal was as their commander was too much, and it was a kind of despotism. At this moment, the maddeningly disgruntled guys stopped their conversation about the captain of the Winter Knights and informed that in any case, this girl was a duchess, and so they had to be polite towards her. But this guy smiled smugly and asked what the others thought about whether their new commander was really a monster, because everyone said that she looked uncannily like an orc. But the other guy looked at him and said that it was probably just more bad rumors, because Julia had only shown herself once at the aristocrats' ball, so they had no reason to believe such words. But then that guy said that even though she had first appeared, it was rumored that her face was like that of an orc, and her body was a monstrous lumpy body. And then, imagining this picture, the guy only awkwardly thought about what he had said. And the other knight with a smile said that it was just a lie of the aristocrats who were blinded by envy. Then, with a sly look at his comrade, said that those who believed in something like that really were idiots. And this phrase seems to have maddened the knight. But Vice Capital calmly said that the cursed sword, and all that was associated with it, it is just a legend and nothing more. But the next moment, interrupting their eternal arguments, and even a looming fight between the knights in the office, entered the protagonist, who said that from today one commander of the Winter Knights, and introduced herself by saying that she was Julia von Rosenthal. The men who looked at her were really confused and did not know how to behave, and at that moment, the protagonist said that it was nice to meet everyone. But after looking at the young guys, literally did not understand why they had such faces. And they just calmly reported that the girl did not match the rumors that they had heard about her. But at that moment, their vice captain looked at his comrades and said that the boys should have shown the slightest respect for the Duchess, who was now their captain. And they immediately, obediently, and quickly lined up in front of the protagonist, and then bowed before their captain and said that they were very happy to greet her. And she looked at each of them with a smile and said that she was honored to meet them. But the next moment, the vice captain looked at the girl slyly and contemptuously and said that although he was madly sorry, but he could not so easily accept the protagonist into their ranks, and if the girl was really going to become their commander, then first she had to surprise them with her skills. And she just calmly agreed, and eventually they went to the battle, where a whole crowd of people gathered to watch it. And then almost all the knights had already managed to lose the fight with the girl. And then the protagonist, looking over the already beaten to death guys, said that she was really disappointed with the skills of the Winter Knights, but she thought they were still above average. Then, with a sly smile, he looked at the vice captain who was her new adversary and asked what he thought about it. But the man looked at her and said that in that case, he was ready to accept her challenge. But he thought to himself that the girl had already fought 9 of them, but no one had even scratched her. And so the young man began to think only that if it were not for this girl, the position of commander would be his. And so he had to defeat her. Then he started to remember that in the last mission of the Winter Knights, their captain died. And he was a good man, and his death was definitely a strong blow to each of the Winter Knights. But then his vice captain, as a humble rider who was not fortunate enough to receive the glory, decided that this is an opportunity that was given to him by God himself, because he was sure he'd worked much harder than all the other knights to succeed. So he decided to take this chance. In the end, there was a battle, and this man was quite determined and put all his strength, so sweated for a couple minutes of battle with the protagonist. And the protagonist herself at this moment felt quite confident and calmly fighting with him with one hand, and only wondered why this guy was so worried. But the next moment, the guy made a decisive leap in her direction, which did not confuse Julia von Rosenthal. And the man himself thought that as soon as this girl appeared, she completely spoiled all his plans, and he had to defeat her so that all of his efforts were not in vain. But at this moment, the protagonist seriously looked at him while blocking the attack, reported that the vice captain was waving his weapon too much, which would definitely not help him. After all, it was better to keep a bright mind and execute attacks with precision. Then she added that from now on, he wouldn't even be able to touch the ends of her hair. Then she resolutely repulsed his attack. And then, looking at it all from the stands, a guy from the Black Lion said that the new captain of the Winter Knights was really great, although she talked to the knights like children. And another excited guy said that they had come to see the battle for a reason. But at that moment, the vice captain concentrated all his last strength for a new blow. And even though it was against the rules, he decided to use magic and rushed at the main game with determination, and mentally stated that this position was always originally intended for him. But the girl just calmly stepped back, withdrawing her body from his attack and keeping a cool face. And in the end, she didn't let herself get hurt. But she thought about the fact that this guy didn't even hide his intentions, and the other people who were around and watching this only mocked the vice captain, and thought about the fact that their man even decided to use sword magic. And apparently he wanted to win so badly that he broke the rules, although it was obvious that he didn't even have a chance, because the main character didn't use even half of her strength. That there were people here who constantly interfered with him with their conversations. And again, mentally repeated that he was fighting in order to get this place for which he tried so hard. But the protagonist calmly repulsed his new attack, and it was clearly not difficult for her. Then she thought that she had to end the fight softly. She didn't want to waste any more time on him. So she used one gift to cut his sword in half, using sword magic for the first and last time in their fight. And then everyone who was now in the spectator arena excitedly wondered if the main character has now used the magic of the sword Aurora, and could not believe that the girl at such a young age was a master of the sword. In the next moment, the man frightened looking at his shattered sword and literally did not know what to do. And the main character calmly looked at him from top to bottom, asked if he would try to fight her again. But he only grudgingly admitted his defeat. As a result, at about the same time, to his captain turned Vice Captain Black Lions, who asked whether Coley had heard about the rumor about the Duchess, because today there was a ceremony of her becoming a knight, and there was also a battle on which he was unfortunately absent. Then he sadly said that he wanted to see the Duchess in person. After all, there were such wonderful rumors about her, especially since she was also a sword master. But after a displeased look at his captain's reaction, he wondered what he was thinking. Then he said that the appearance of the protagonist was really beautiful. Her family was noble, and she was also a master of the sword. After approaching the captain's desk, he asked if he wasn't absolutely sorry that he hadn't seen the new captainess yet. But the guy, calmly looking over his papers and documents, said that he really had nothing to regret, and thought about the fact that this was the only Duchess heir to his family, and also the sword guardian of the empire. So the surname alone would be enough to be interesting. But no one has ever become a sword master among women, and there were rumors that this girl had previously been cursed. But at that moment, the vice captain of the Black Lion literally shone and said that their captain had to allow him to go to tomorrow's meeting to see the main character. He only looked at his subordinate's reaction and smiled. then told him to go practice. At this time, the protagonist thought about the fact that before returning to the throne, Crown Prince Leonardo suddenly decided to start a war of conquest, and his plan succeeded. But because of this in the first war, all the Winter Knights died. And then the protagonist, thinking about it, thought that with such skills, the past will definitely repeat itself, and the Winter Knights are definitely weak compared to the Black Lions. For the Lions were led by Kieran Winter, and all of his swordsmen were gifted with talent and willing to give their lives for this young man. And thinking about it, the protagonist realized that it would be good to increase the intensity of training of her knights so that they could at least reach the level of their family. But at that moment, I distracted her from her thoughts. An Imperial guard came into the office and excitedly informed her that His Majesty the Emperor had ordered her to be brought in. And the girl only excitedly raised her seat and said that in that case, he should have taken her to the Emperor. And finally finding herself before the Emperor, the protagonist bowed and announced that it was a great pleasure to greet His Majesty and that Duchess Julia von Rosenthal had arrived. But when she opened her eyes and looked carefully at the person who greeted her, she saw that the Crown Prince Leonardo was now in front of her, and she only thought unhappily that it had been unpleasant to see his face since morning. In the end, the Emperor said that he had heard earlier that the proclamation ceremony had gone splendidly, and that it seemed to have left many people indifferent. And Julia von Rosenthal calmly said that she understood the reaction of the Winter Knights, for it must have come as a surprise to them that she had been made their captain. And the Emperor, in turn, calmly looked at her and said that it was probably true. After all, everyone knew that the Winter Knights were a strong pillar of the Empire, so the Emperor said that he hoped that the protagonist would become a wonderful leader. And she calmly looked at his smiling face and promised that she would do her best to make his ambitions come true. The Emperor looked at the Crown Prince with displeasure and said that the protagonist had finished her thought very quickly and did not want to talk anymore. And Prince Leonardo only reminded that he had warned about it earlier. But at that moment, carefully looking at the protagonist, returned Crown Prince Leonardo, who said that Wu did ask his father and mother to celebrate this event. And the protagonist, in shock, asked what he meant, and then looking at her shocked face, Prince Leonardo explained that he cannot just miss the appointment of the new sword master, and especially that she became the head of an important order. And the protagonist only thought that this is exactly what she madly did not want. But Prince Leonardo said with a smile that they didn't have to congratulate her, and she was fine. But Prince Leonardo said with a smile that no refusal would be accepted. After all, when a girl becomes a sword master at such a young age, it's a miracle, and God himself blessed her. And so he thought it was worthy of congratulations. And the protagonist looked at him and wondered when this performance would finally end, for it made her mad. Then Prince Leonardo appealed to the Emperor to confirm his words, and he calmly said that the Swordmaster's birthday party was a tribute from the Empire. And then the protagonist was unhappy about the fact that she simply could not twice refuse the offer of His Majesty the Emperor, especially that in such a case, her father will have serious problems. And the prince and the Emperor literally glowed with happiness and said that she really made a great decision. After which the prince with a smile said that he is already anticipating the grand event. And the protagonist only discreetly thanked him and went out. In the end, when they were alone in the office, the young man was approached by the Emperor, who asked whether the guy was sure of his success. But he only slyly looked at him and said that his confidence was absolutely, as he will definitely win the heart of the protagonist at this celebration. And then listening to him, the Emperor stated that his son was really self-confident. But afterwards he confessed that the family of this girl was the sword of the guardians of the Empire, and it was necessary to induce her to their side. At this time, the protagonist was walking down the street and thinking about the fact that this holiday was actually very uncomfortable for her, because she did not want to spend more time with this young man, because she had not very good memories at this reception. For in the past, Crown Prince Leonardo had given feasts on the occasion of every exploit, and at first the girl attended them gladly, but then the scornful looks for her inappropriately dressed face, and the insulting glances in her direction, and the taunts made her start to doubt herself and hate this place. And then the only one who was near was a young man who came to her and told Julia von Rosenthal that she was really beautiful. And it was because of his support that the protagonist fell in love with him. After which the protagonist admitted that she was really fooled by his words like a fool, but realized that she could not let it happen again. Then she slapped her cheeks a couple of times and declared that it was high time to shake off all those bad memories, because she had to live her life for herself and not let anyone else fool her. At about the same time in the bar came a company of knights with a girl, and then she immediately noticed Chris, who lost the fight with the main character, and smiling happily told the knight to go first, and she would join him later, but he only agreed and tried to convince himself that he had not been abandoned. Then the girl sat down at the young man's table and smiled at him. Then she told him that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. It was Guard Corps member Aisha, and at that moment Chris Bellad looked at her and asked her what she was doing here. And she calmly said that she had decided to come in during the patrol. But the man smiled and said that apparently her Guard Corps had a lot of free time. But Aisha only wondered if the man had no service now that he was sitting in this place. But he calmly said that they usually patrol around the palace, so they had free time. But after the girl carefully looked at the young man, she said that he was drunk, which was not like him, and she seemed madly concerned about his condition. So she asked him what had happened, but seeing his disgruntled face, she said that if he didn't want to talk about it, he didn't have to, although she was still curious. And then the man set down his glass and said that the Winter Knights had a new crew. And the girl just said that apparently Chris Bellad had hoped to be the captain instead of the one who had been appointed. And she wondered who had become their boss. And then Chris Bellad announced that Julia von Rosenthal had become their captain. And thinking about it, Aisha realized that she had heard that name before. And then Chris Bellad calmly explained that she was the sole heiress of her family, and she became their commander. And then finally, the girl's memories came the image of the protagonist, and she smilingly said that this is apparently the cursed duchess from a cursed family. And in the highest circles, this story is very famous. Aisha came closer to him and asked him why he was talking like that, and if the girl was even prettier than her. The man calmly said that his pride had been hurt, so he wanted to leave. But at that moment, the girl hugged him tightly and told him that he couldn't leave so easily until he answered her question. And he only grudgingly told her not to embarrass him and finally got off him. Aisha said that she was waiting for a response from Chris, because earlier the man had said that there was no one better than her, and Aisha said that she was remembering his words from 10 years ago. But it seems that such words madly hurt her, so she angrily pushed him on the bench, calmly turned around and started to leave. Then said that she was no longer interested in listening to his drunken stories, and if he decided to marry a rich, noble girl, then in that case, she will take revenge on him. Then she looked at his reddened face and asked him not to drink so much, and the man looked at her and seemed either embarrassed by Aisha's behavior and her words or displeased. At this time, the main character quietly strolling through the garden and thought about the fact that the commander should have been their vice captain, so she was even a little sorry for him. But at that moment, a guy ran up to her and smiled and greeted her commander, and asked when the girl had time to come back. Then, without waiting for an answer, he awkwardly rubbed the back of his head and apologized for what had happened this morning. But she calmly told him not to worry about something like that, because she understood his behavior. And then he bowed and thanked their commander for such generosity. But at that moment, the protagonist turned around and, looking at the area around, asked where I was now vice captain. And it seems from such a question, the guy was really shocked. After which he awkwardly said that he couldn't quite give an answer to this question because he seemed to have forgotten where Chris might be. And a disgruntled Julia von Rosenthal only wondered whether the question was so difficult. But at that moment, they were torn away from thinking by another guy who said hello to the commander and stated that she had come, and then said that the deputy was apparently in the recreation area. And at that moment, the protagonist asked what it was. And the guy just smiled and said that he'd seen Chris a while ago in that exact spot, and then awkwardly apologized for what had happened recently. But the girl calmly said that he really didn't have to worry about it, and then warned him that she wanted to go away for a while. He smiled and asked the commander to return as soon as possible. But at that moment, the insanely worried knight who was looking at their departing commander asked if the knight really didn't understand what state their vice captain Chris was in. But he only calmly and without thinking reported that their vice captain had been drinking since lunch. But after his words, he thought about what he had said and shockingly realized that most likely now their vice captain was waiting for a showdown, and realized that Julia should not have said that. But the other knight only grudgingly thought that it was too late to regret. At that moment, Julia von Rosenthal came to the vice captain's office and knocked, saying that she would like to discuss the training program with him. But not receiving a reply, she realized that she had to come in, as there were signs of presence inside. So she opened the door apologetically, and the first thing she found was Chris lying on the couch, who was clearly in a drunken delirium. And then she took a couple of steps inside. Julia von Rosenthal clearly smelled the odor of alcohol. And so she went inside and hit his couch, thus making the young man wake up. And when he began to wipe his face tiredly, he still did not realize who was in front of him, so he wondered what idiot dared to wake him up. And at that moment, the girl looked at him and shouted that she was the idiot who dared to wake up that drunken bastard who was drinking and sleeping during working hours. After which she looked at his frightened face and told him that he was sleeping during working hours and was also drunk, and therefore she did not understand how she should perceive such behavior. But the man only said with a maddeningly embarrassed and displeased look down his eyes that it was not so at all. And then looking up at his face, Julia von Rosenthal asked him why he had gotten drunk and slept here. But when she didn't get an answer, she said she was madly disappointed in him. And she decided to warn him right away that she didn't plan to work with slackers. Then she went to the door and opened it in all seriousness and told him that in 20 minutes she would be waiting for him on the practice field, and she would give him a chance to redeem himself. And then she left the room. Finally, after a while, she found herself on the training field and looked at her knights carefully and told them that they all had to stop now because they were going to have one duel and the rules were simple. Then she said that after pairing up, they take wooden swords and demonstrate their skills, and they do it before sunset. After that, he looked at the vice captain who had arrived and said that it seemed that everyone already knew that the use of magic was forbidden during the fight, and ordered them to start. In the end, everyone began to train, and the protagonist did not shirk, and also began to train with the others. And then, looking at all this, Knight only frightened thought that the duel of their captain looked really cruel, although they were not enemies. At that moment, the main character and her vice capital were in a duel, and then calmly turned to him. The girl said that he must have been madly upset that she lost. Afterwards, she threw him to the ground with a slight movement of her hand, and told him that in that case, he should not have complained about his life, but to become stronger, he had to train hard. And then gazing into this frightening picture, the terrified knights reported that their new captain was indeed insanely frightening. And they did not understand why the girl was so cruel to them. But at that moment, Chris Bellad resolutely grabbed the wooden sword and made a small jerk so that the protagonist away from him, with all seriousness, said that their fight was not over. And the protagonist that ogled the young man's so confident look seemed madly pleased with his fighting attitude and hoped it would do him good. In the end, already in the evening, comrades held their vice captain, and only at this point the protagonist reported that their duel was over, and they were all well done. And those only wondered if everything was fine with their vice captain, and the latter only grudgingly thought that training to become better was a really stupid idea, because people like him have been practicing until they can't breathe. But they still can't become geniuses, because no matter how hard he tries, and no matter how hard he trains, he will never be able to beat the main character. So he thought that in order to win, he had to overthrow the girl by any other means. At this time, the protagonist, waving her sword, thought that she should have become stronger because her strength is not enough to resist all her enemies. Then, chopping the leaves flying towards her in half, she thought that she was to become the best knight in the entire empire, and that was her goal, which she would swiftly pursue. But after practicing, she hid her sword and thought that before returning, she would first have to repair the trees. Sometimes she just couldn't control her powers, and because of that, she damaged the terrain insanely badly. But the next moment she felt something, so she immediately ran and didn't understand how she could feel such a powerful force, because it was clearly an unusual person. After that, running through the forest, I thought that perhaps it was not just trespassers, but something much more serious, and hearing a rumble, I thought that perhaps it was a dragon. But after hiding behind a tree and looking around the area, she realized her mistake, and in front of her was Kieran Winter, off the Black Lions, who was training. And the protagonist reasonably stated that he was really dazzling with his sword, which made her really admire the guy. But her appearance did not go unnoticed. So the guy, carefully looking in the direction of the protagonist, asked why she was standing there all this time and ordered her to show up as soon as possible, and then said that if she did not show up, he would kill her. And at that moment, the protagonist awkwardly stepped out of the shade of the tree and apologized for disturbing the young man during his training, and added that it was not her plan at all. And then carefully flew away. Her young man stated that apparently before him was one of the Winter Knights. Then, looking at her sword, immediately realized that it seems that this girl was Julia von Rosenthal, after which she hid her sword behind her belt and wondered why the girl had decided to interfere with his training. But she calmly said that if someone was spewing so much energy near the Imperial Palace, He should have expected people nearby to rush over to check on after reporting that she had seen nothing, and in any case apologized for the inconvenience. And then thinking about it, Kieran Winter stated that today someone had been appointed as the new chief of the Winter Knights, and it was her. Ugg, looking at him in surprise, asked if the rumors had spread so quickly. After that, she extended her hand for a handshake and said that she wanted to formally introduce herself to him and smiled, saying that she was Julia von Rosenthal. And as she knew, this guy was the captain of the Black Lions. But the boy only looked at her unhappily and thought that this place was not a good place to introduce himself. And the disgruntled Julia von Rosenthal only wondered if he would not even say that it was a pleasure to meet her, to which the captain of the Black Lions reasonably remarked that he saw no reason to do so. Then the protagonist, with a smile, said that she seems to be quite pleased to see a strong man. It would be great if they could compete a little. But just looking at her, wondered if she had just challenged him to a duel. But the girl only calmly confirmed his speculation. Then the protagonist sat down on a vacant spot on a rock and stated that from such a jog while she followed from her training place to here, she was insanely thirsty and asked if he had some water in a flask. He immediately handed her his water and threw it in her direction. Although he seemed a little displeased, but he calmly kept silent. And the protagonist thanked him and said that she would definitely repay him for his favor as she lived, and that looking at such a protagonist only calmly looked around and smiled, because he found such a girl's reaction quite amusing. And finally, the protagonist, after a while of drinking water, threw the flask back to him and thanked him with a bright smile, then said that she would be leaving. And at that moment, the moon perfectly illuminated her silver hair. Then the protagonist added that now the captain could safely continue his training.